Well, welcome, Bruins, to tonight's UCLA Alumni Association Town Hall. I am your UCLA Alumni Association President, D'Artagnan Scorza, and I am proud to join you tonight as we talk about something that's actually happening right now throughout our entire campus. We're actually joined by an amazing colleague, Vice Chancellor Mary Osako, who is UCLA's inaugural Vice Chancellor for Strategic Communications. In this role, since September 2019, she oversees communications, media relations, brand marketing, and the UCLA Content Studio, which provides strategic insights and helps maintain and enhance UCLA's reputation as a world-class public research university. Vice Chancellor Osako has more than 20 years of experience leading complex communication efforts at Fortune 500 companies, including Activision, Blizzard, Amazon, Yahoo, and Haven Tower Group. And Bruins, Mary is a UCLA graduate. She earned her degree in psychology with a specialization in Asian American studies. Welcome, Vice Chancellor Osako.
Thank you so much, Dart. It's so good to see you. And
it's such a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead.
I have to say, you made me want to be a graduating student when I saw your commencement. So inspiring.
Well, I can tell you, I really appreciate that. You know, I was sharing with folk in the association. I said, I don't know how this is being received. I didn't have the benefit of hearing the audience's reaction. So, you know, the positive reception, I think thus far has been really encouraging. And I'm just so grateful for the support of folk on our team alumni and our students who helped me prepare it. And so thank you for lifting it up and recognizing it here. I really appreciate that.
Amazing.
Yeah. So Bruins, again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Really excited to have you in the audience. You know, we put on these monthly town halls just so that you in our alumni community can stay aware of what's happening with the university and also stay connected to our association. We want to make sure that you have access to university affairs, that you understand sort of the issues that are impacting our students and our alums today, but to also make sure that you get to meet special guests who are leading initiatives and efforts on the campus like Vice Chancellor Osako. So, you know, tonight's town hall is going to focus on something that many universities around the country have been dealing with. This idea of campus buildings and the naming that takes place. You know, a recent report from Inside Higher Ed showed that Yale announced it was removing the name of a 19th century politician and pro-slavery alumnus, John C. Calhoun, from one of its residential colleges. Similarly, the Center College of Kentucky reported that the name of late U.S. Supreme Court Associate Justice John C. McReynolds was being removed from a campus building because McReynolds, as a donor of that prestigious institution, had faced a number of challenges and controversies as well. There are a number of universities and organizations around the country that are really beginning to grapple with this idea of place and space and how we tell the story of people, you know, who have been both represented in our community, who currently attend our campuses, but really, you know, what thinking strategically about what naming means for our society and what it means in our space, whose story gets to be told, how that story is told, whose legacy gets to be remembered in a public space, and especially in a university so prominent as UCLA. So all this attention to monuments and campus buildings has been part of a larger conversation in our society as we begin to evaluate the symbols and the things that we celebrate. And as we sort of renew our ideas about what it means to represent diverse points of view as well. So with that being said, I thank you, Mary, for joining us tonight to talk about campus naming with our alumni, because this has really been an important conversation on the campus as well. So can you briefly just talk to us about what the campus naming committee is, what you've been doing in this area, and frame this for our alumni audience so that they understand exactly what UCLA is beginning to grapple with.
Yeah, thank you. And I will note that, Dart, you joined me on this committee, and it's just, you know, the thoughtfulness and the hard questions and the even harder answers that we're just sort of scratching the surface on. So it's been great just to be able to partner with you on this. As Dart mentioned, gosh, this is a question that has many universities, not even just universities, as Dart and I have talked about in the past, but places, municipalities in general, in terms of the naming of spaces, buildings for UCLA, big spaces where people congregate, and what that symbolizes in terms of, are we expressing and telling the story of UCLA's values? And that's a tough one. You know, you mentioned Yale. Part of what we've been doing as our committee, which is a committee that I chair here, is really number one, just trying to gain knowledge. You know, one of the things is we're not the pioneer on this really hard question. So we're doing our best and really making a concerted effort to learn from others. To frame this, I will say that Chancellor Jean Block was the one, you know, who really had this charge for us. He pulled together this committee, asked me to chair it, with really thoughtful minds. Dart is just one of them, who you all know and love. Historians like David Yu, who is our vice provost, to, you know, Rhea Turtletub, who you all know and who I know and love, who's the vice chancellor of EA. And the list goes on to about 18, 19 folks, including student voices. And what he charged us with just last September was evaluating, really seeing if the names of buildings and spaces communicate our commitment to diversity and inclusivity as a university. So, you know, I think I might say that we've been asked to do two things specifically here. And one is to recommend how the campus can reorganize or recognize a diverse set of voices out there from our history by renaming spaces that are currently have generic names. So as an example, for those of you who've been on campus or have kids that have stayed here, Sunset Village might be a really good example of that. The second thing that the chancellor has asked our committee to do is develop a process, a really thoughtful process by which the campus can consider whether or not to remove the name of a building or a space. And if their namesake has left, you know, especially if the namesake of those buildings have left a complicated, you know, legacy that may not align with our values and principles today. These are really two hard things that require a lot of thought and research, conversations, consultation with all community groups, you know, at UCLA, including this one that I am a part of, the Alumni Network. And, you know, our committee is really focused on transparency. You know, we don't want to go and make these decisions in a bubble, nor do we ever endeavor to do that. And we are humbled by this really big task. And so what we've set out to do is we're holding, gosh, so many listening sessions with different groups, alumni included. I think I'll work with the team on distributing the feedback that we want to hear. And the first thing is feedback on the types of questions, just the questions that we should be asking, even before and as we set forth in trying to determine the criteria. And that was a really intentional conversation. And Dart, I'd love, you know, I'd love you to chime in too, but we as a committee thought, we're not going to go with a set of draft criteria and say, all right, here it is, go feedback on it. We're going to present it to you and we're going to call that, you know, our tour. What we decided to do was to say, we're going to have questions and ask you, what questions should we be asking? Which ones are we forgetting? Tell us. And from there, we will ask those questions and then get to the writing component of that criteria.
Yeah, I think that's right. Thank you so much for that, Mary. I really appreciate that. Folk, I do want to lift up what Mary's just said in that, you know, this campus naming committee has really been charged with, as she mentioned, sort of thinking about these things and also asking all of you what your thoughts are. So as you've just seen in the chat, we've posted a question for you. that if you actually have questions for us, we've posted a link, the email for you, so that if you have questions for us, you can email Julie Sina at JSina at support.ucla.edu, and we'll take your questions as well. And so, to that point about what this committee is wanting to hear from all of you, let's go ahead and get into some of those questions that are coming in today. And Mary, I will tell you, our alums are actually asking some really interesting questions right now. So, one of the things that's come up thus far is about sort of just even why are we doing this, right? So one of the questions that's coming from the audience is about how social justice wokeness has now sort of maybe hit UCLA, and is it affecting the decisions to decertify certain building names? So what do you think about this idea of now people becoming woke, and that is one of the reasons why we're talking about changing the names on the campus?
I think that there's no denying, the past year plus, there's been a reckoning. And I think that given that society is really asking these good questions and these really hard questions. And as you said, Dart, at the top of it, you started out, talking about what Yale was doing. And so this isn't necessarily new, but it is a time for all of us to take a step back and really think about, our values and how we're communicating them through names, legacy names, and really interrogating that. From my perspective, I think it's a really valuable conversation. And what I've learned being part of this committee, and but we always invite speakers at the top of each committee meeting to educate us. And I guess that the other side of that I will say is, what's been really great is it's not new scholarly work for UCLA. There are a lot of people who've been studying exactly this, what a name means and what it should mean and what it symbolizes and how a community interacts with that, and positively and negatively. And I don't know, I've just been really inspired by that. So, I don't know if it's I think there is a reckoning in the world, which is great. And I also say that UCLA has done a lot. There are a lot of really wonderful scholars who've been really dedicated in this type of work, and we're excited to learn from them.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's some great folk that have been diving into some of these conversations, and I think in many ways it's helping to drive, really this reflection, this moment of reflection that we're all in, right? I think we've talked about Jan Steps as another site. We just opened up this meeting with a land acknowledgement. We talked about the history of Jan Steps and their relationship to the Native, in many ways potentially exploiting the Native American community, right? So we have some legacies here at UCLA that we now have an opportunity to really evaluate and think about. It does, and by the way, I will tell you, it doesn't mean that we need to erase those histories or erase those names, but instead maybe finding ways to tell these stories so that it also honors the people that were impacted by the actions of these people that we have lifted up. Now, given that, some folk have been asking about how this all ties into. I'm gonna shift gears just for a second here because I think it's a part of the same line of questioning. How this ties into how UCLA, communicates around issues related to hate or deals with campus groups that engage in hate speech. And so, can you talk about what StratComs does when faced with people who, maybe they don't agree with the perspective that UCLA has? I saw some stuff on Twitter the other day where they were like, "Oh my God, these liberal professors are indoctrinating our kids," and then they went into this full diatribe about what people of color and women and LGBT people are, right? I mean, we all have the freedom of speech, but how does UCLA, manage, and how does StratCom help manage conversations around speech that may be considered and defined as hate?
Yeah, we have tried to follow twin North Stars from a communications perspective. Understanding that UCLA is a big tent. The viewers who are on right now and taking a listen on this, it's a really big tent. And so inclusivity means inclusivity of voices. Obviously we're at academic institutions, so there's that academic freedom and commitment to First Amendment matters. So what we've tried to do in Stratcom is follow the twin stars of transparency and humanity. And that has really led us for the last, year and a half, I will say. And that's applicable for the matter that you brought up, which is, oh my gosh, you're leaning to this way or that way. Can't believe this guy came and spoke on campus. Does that mean that you support them? Because that's what you're implicitly doing. Can't believe this. We've just tried to stick to the twin stars of transparency and humanity, and really trying to think, let us be transparent. Let us try and offer the why and the context behind these things, because sometimes it's not simple. A lot of times it's nuanced, but also not a lot of people want to hear the nuance sometimes, right? Like that's the challenge from a communications perspective. We're in a digital age. Like you and I are on Facebook Live right now, and so it can be a very a time where you've got to communicate a point that is nuanced, and yet do it in a way where it's people are looking for that black and white. So I feel like we've gotten it right a lot of times, but we've got it wrong too. I will say that for my group in strategic communications, my hope is that we continue to make mistakes sometimes and not nail it. Because to me, that means that we're human, number one, but also that we are trying to think boldly and in a new way to communicate UCLA's story. And that's going to take a little bit of experimenting because the
Yeah.
whole world has been in flux. And so that's really what our twin stars have been.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's really helpful because it, in some ways, lays the value, right, and the values and sort of the frame by which the naming committee is approaching some of this work. So let's talk about this now as these questions come in. Folk want to know, like, so okay, fine. You're undertaking these issues. You're reviewing sort of the legacy of these people, right? You're considering things around speech and maybe the role that some of these folk have played in time, but who should be the ones involved in the honorific naming decisions related to buildings or spaces, or who should have the power to evaluate potential naming? Should it be the community? Should it be, a university committee? Should it be a specific body? But like, who should do that? And how do you bring in the voices of people that have been historically excluded?
Yeah, my instinct is yes, we want to, in terms of who do we want to hear from? You and I are in these monthly meetings, we want to hear from everyone. And what mechanisms can our committee set in place like this, where we are encouraging and just trying to get in front of as many audiences as we can? Invite us, let us present this to you. We're grappling. If you have a point of view, we want to hear it. And so that's partially it. But in terms of who makes the decision of if a building gets denamed, let's just say, that has a very specific process as part of the UC system. Berkeley went through it before us. They went through this process and they decided that one of the halls, they're not going to name it that anymore, Bull Hall. Now, what they did was say, we're going to take that name down, but then there was going to be another process by which folks figure out, all right, so it's down, what do we name it? Because that feels like that's its own sort of scholarly work. So we've been, as you and I and our fellow committee members have really been thinking about that. And where we are right now as a committee, let me pause there. So what Berkeley did was decide that their committee, they took it to their chancellor and said, this is our recommendation, who cleared it to go to the UCOP president to then take up. So there's a whole process by which this happens. For UCLA and where our committee is right now, we are actively working on creating the criteria and getting consultation on that and from the community, from whoever has knowledge on this. We want to hear it, as well as then figuring out, okay, what's the process by which one of the proposals comes, And then is there a separate entity? Is there, a subgroup? Is it a whole new committee that serves as, okay, we're going to make a decision and run this criteria through the process, and we will come back with a recommendation to the chancellor as to what we should do.
Mhm.
We're at phase one. We talk about this a lot in our committee meetings, and I think it's worth bringing up here with fellow alumni, which is there's this tension. There's a tension between get it done. No one likes that name. We all know it should change of whatever space. Just hurry up and get it done to this is hard. And we have to pay respect to this really challenging, big question. So we've got to do it right. We've got to get in there and get thoughtful and spend the time to do things like this and get the feedback. Um,
Right.
that's
That's
on process.
No, I appreciate you sharing that. You've actually answered quite a few questions for us tonight. And I think, folk are certainly lighting up the chat here and sending in questions. So thank you all again. If you're just joining us, I am your UCLA Alumni Association President, D'Artagnan Scorza, along with Vice Chancellor of Strategic Communications, Mary Osako. Tonight, we're talking about campus naming, amongst other issues here in the university. We invite you to share your questions at jsina@support.ucla.edu. Please go ahead and send in your question to jsina@support.ucla.edu. We'd love to hear from you tonight. Now, just note that we're taking this feedback and we're going to be able to use these questions that you're sharing with us so that it can inform what the campus committee is doing. And I also want to just acknowledge and lift up that this campus committee is fairly representative. It's a diverse body, has people from across departments, different racial and ethnic and gender backgrounds, and sort of a whole host of other ways in which it is diverse. So I just want to, I think some of the questions that are coming in is who's on the committee, how are you representing the needs? There are students that are on the committee, there are alumni that are on the committee, right? So I just want you all to know more about the composition and response to some of the questions that you've asked. Now, here's the thing that I think has been lifted up. Mary, you're in strategic communication, so you're all about storytelling, all about narratives. And there were two questions that came in that sort of talks about narrative. One is, how does the work of the committee impact the narrative of UCLA? But the other one is, well, look, UCLA is more than 100 years old now, and there's nostalgia associated with the naming of a hall. Look, you change Royce Hall, you change Powell Hall. We know those names, right? But something suddenly comes out, and it's like, oh, Royce did this or Powell did that. Does that mean that we throw that nostalgia out? So how do we address this naming and this change in the way that doesn't sort of dismiss people's feelings about all of this, but also how does this shape what we say about what UCLA is or who UCLA is as an institution?
Yeah, that's precisely the question that the committee is actively trying to find different voices to educate us on and come up with the criteria. We're in committee meetings where gosh, is the criteria, you've done nothing wrong, but there's a better name. So take that name off and do something that's more relevant of today. Don't know. Or should it just be if a name is so out of whack with our values today, then those are the only names of buildings that we should really consider that are honorifically named. These are really tough questions. I would say to alumni that, quick story, but when I was at UCLA, Powell was going through renovations. So they set up this temporary library called Towel. So anyone who was at UCLA, same year as me in the 90s, it always struck me though, and it's sort of relevant to this conversation because you couldn't get too far from the name Powell. Because that's the library. So what they did was just change one little letter in there because names are powerful in that way. And they named it Towel because it's temporary Powell. And so, I think about that and I have fond memories of that. And I have fond memories of being in front of, in Wilson Plaza and practicing, dances for the Asian American sorority I was in. That's how you're going to refer to it. And we have to recognize, I should say, that there are real memories associated with that.
Mhm.
I will call out Dart is the one who is the committee chair on what is a memorialization subcommittee within our committee. And this is a way in which we make sure that we are honoring or recognizing, maybe both, the history, right? So say if some building, it goes through a process and we say, we're gonna rename that. You know, some committee says, we're gonna rename it. It goes up the channel and says, yep, good, rename it. We wanna make sure that we're preserving that history though, because we don't wanna erase history. And as a committee, we've really talked about that. And we've learned from other universities, you know, you don't want to, this is part of the university's lived experience too. So we want to contextualize, we want to educate, we don't want to just erase the bad things. That's a disservice. So I throw that out there because although I don't have answers to those questions, I'm, you know, talking about the process by which we're trying to get all of that and the feedback from our community. But that's one thing we've talked about. And Dart, you've done an excellent job in just researching how other institutions have done it. But I could say, and you could say better than I, you know, erasing the history of something, that's not what we're doing here.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think just a preview for our audience tonight, you know, one of the things that we're thinking about in the memorialization subcommittee is how, you know, you sort of tell the story and the history of memory, right? Like how we rather use memory and tell the story of our history in a way that actually even meets the needs of a new population. How we, you know, can use digital technology. Maybe we don't have that plaque there anymore, but if you take out your phone there and you utilize an AR app or use a digital map, you might be able to see sort of what was once there, or even think about sort of how that can show up in really dynamic ways. So I'm just previewing for you all some of the conversations that are taking place in our memorialization subcommittee. But really the idea here is not to erase history, it's to really tell stories in a way that honor everyone and their participation, which gets us to the other side of this question. You know, often people are like concerned, well, what if we change, and what would that mean for us? And but people don't really talk about the folk that have been there for decades, whose stories are not being told, right? So let's take a step back for a second. When I was an undergrad there at UCLA, we used to do what was called the People of Color Tour. And the People of Color Tour was a tour that our student groups and our Black students put on for new students, new Black students to come to the campus who wanted to learn about the history of UCLA. So we would talk to them about, you know, Dr. King standing at the steps there, as what is known as Jan Steps, and giving his history, giving a speech and talking about the civil rights movement here at UCLA. We would talk about, you know, Bunch Hall and the role and legacy of Ralph Bunch, as well as Arthur Ashe and Louvel, and all these other places where the Days of Defiance in Royce and in Powell, and all these other things that took place on the campus in a way to sort of preserve the history of African-American student activism, as well as the leadership and the role of students of color in this campus. And so I'm going to get to that a question here shortly about one of those specific buildings. So I'm sure you know which one I'm referring to. But how is the committee, Mary, how is the committee thinking about the trauma or the lack of psychological safety that exists when students, especially students who are marginalized, are on campus, and there are years that have gone by where these students feel like their voices are not heard, their stories are not being told, or the people who, you know, whose stories are being told created harm to their communities. How is the committee considering that sort of aspect of the work and of this equation?
Yeah, you know, there's so many, this is such a good related matter, right? Because we're talking about the history of the university. What is a university? It's its people, it's its community. And so how are we, you know, trying to better understand and respect and create space for those marginalized voices to ensure that we are taking into account that, you know, the one thing is, you know, that we're doing is we have great people on this committee, and one big task that we are undertaking by a really wonderful subcommittee chair and the team is just getting an inventory of all the names of spaces on campus. that's a big thing, and that's not readily available. I love the fact that as subcommittee chair of the memorialization committee of this, you're thinking about the interactivity and the dynamism, right? Because stories change and they evolve in the context. Like, context is really important. We don't have that. And so we're trying to get to the foundational part of, let's pull those names together. Now let's look at it. Maybe a group looks at it in totality. In totality, figure out, all right, so this group isn't represented at all. This group isn't represented at all. Like, who's up first? Who's up second? How are we thinking about these things in the broader picture versus let's take up the thing where you've got enough people who are for it and submitting proposals. Well, writing a thoughtful proposal takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy, it takes people. Some groups don't have that. And I think it's really important for this question that we are not there yet. But the question, and what I feel really great about, is a question that we talk about in our committee meetings is, what about them? The folks who can't write proposals. So that's a question that we are intentionally thinking about and trying, and we'll create mechanisms, a group will create mechanisms so that we don't forget about that. But Dart, you just hit the nail on the head of, this is, we see that. And at UCLA, we just want to make sure that we are creating space and we're saying it out loud, because it's a really easy trap to fall into.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you so much for that. So, folks, if you're just joining me, I'm your UCLA Alumni Association president, and I'm so proud to be here tonight with Vice Chancellor of Strategic Communications, Mary Osako, who's talking to us about campus naming and the role that that plays in sort of the history, in many ways, and the legacy of UCLA. Now, I want to acknowledge that that there are some of you out there who may not necessarily be able to see me. So I am, I think I'm a young man with a beard and with hair covering my face, with wearing a blue jacket and a white shirt. I'm also here from Los Angeles and served in my community, but also went to UCLA as both an undergrad and grad. So for those of you who may be visually impaired, I want you to know you're seeing us on screen right now. We're having a great conversation with Vice Chancellor Mary Osako here today. Also, we have a special guest joining us tonight. So be sure to stick around with us, because in the next 10 minutes or so, we're going to have that guest join us to talk about sort of how this is affecting people. Because look, UCLA as a land-grant institution was built on land, frankly, the land of people who were stewarding it and are already here. We often sort of ignore the histories and the legacies of the first peoples of this unceded and ancestral territory that we now call today is UCLA. And so we just want to acknowledge that that this conversation is really an opportunity for us to tell the truth, right? To be truth tellers in our history and our society, and to really begin to reconcile and reckon with our past in a way that is healthy, that is healing, and that is thoughtful. So through this campus naming committee, we're taking on some of these conversations in dynamic ways. And so I want to also thank our board members who have joined us tonight. Both current and former members, Ruthie Flores-Ratana and Paco Ratana, who are with us, joining this conversation, as well as folk like John Gong. John always has been so encouraging and so supportive of this work. I just want to thank you, John, for your leadership in this space, as well as many of the staff from Team Alumni that are here making tonight's town hall possible. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get to this next question, Mary, as we think about the impact of this. And by the way, I have some personal questions for you too. It's not going to be all campus naming because we want to know more about you. But let's talk about Campbell Hall. Now,
Yeah.
our alums, when I joined the campus naming committee, that's one of the first things they reached out and asked me about. They said, hey, Dart, what are we doing about Campbell Hall? For those of you who are not aware, Campbell Hall is the site of where Bunchy Carter and John Huggins were murdered and believed to be assassinated by the FBI or through sort of a campaign that was led by the FBI. And so there's this long history and legacy of activism that happens here on campus, and Campbell Hall sort of represents that history given the death of those two Black Panthers at that time. So folk are asking, what are you going to do about Campbell Hall? Or, there's actually a few questions that have come in. Are you going to rename it? How are you going to address it? What are you going to approach? How are you going to approach it? And I just want to create some space to respond to that. But I know folk have submitted a petition regarding the renaming of Campbell Hall. So Mary, just talk to us about how, because that's not the only petition that's come in. Let's talk to folk about how the Campus Naming Committee is handling petitions as it relates to Campbell Hall, but other spaces like Jan Steps that have been shared with us.
Yeah, Jan Steps, Campbell. These are the two, proposals that aren't new. As we learned as part of one of our committee meetings where we invited folks to really educate us and talk to us, the context, the history, the point of view there. This is a long sort of ask that's been in the environment for years. The short answer, and this is again, for those that may not have been on a little bit earlier, I talked about the tension, right? It's like, hurry up. We've been, this is something we want answers on now, yesterday. Like, what are y'all doing? We got to spend, we have to be thoughtful on this. And these are hard questions. We want to make sure the process by which we're creating the criteria includes voices from the community. Our community is large and our tent is big. And we've had meetings in the committee where we have acknowledged it's not going to be fast enough for ourselves and for others. But we have this awesome responsibility to make sure that we are seeking out voices out there that aren't necessarily ready to respond. I have this in my here, going to take time. So I don't have answers on Campbell outside of saying it's a proposal. We are educating ourselves on that. We are thinking of the criteria by which and the process by which we hope that we know that will get, go through the process of determining, if it should be unnamed, name something else, what that name is. So that's transparently where we are. I think I share this in Dart. I don't know if you want to add anything, but gosh, learning about the history, directly from people who have not only worked on this, believe in it, passionate, all those things. That's been one of the best experiences in being on this committee. Those are the stories we want to hear. Those are the stories we need to hear. So, I might say that on Campbell specifically.
I think that's right. Thank you so much for sharing that, Mary. We have invited folk that are working on those issues to the space to share with the committee, to hear from them, to learn from them, to understand the importance of either those proposals, but also of either the proposal, but as well as sort of the history and the institutional knowledge that they carry related to these issues. So I think that's one of the ways that the committee has been seeking to both elevate voices, but also make sure that there's space created for this dialogue. So again, thank you so much for sharing that. Now, here's the thing. Mary, you've been here since 2019. And I know as an undergrad, sort of coming full circle, this has to be a unique experience for you. But what has it been like returning to the campus, returning to the place that helped to, in some ways build a pathway and create a journey for you? What has it been like since you've now been Vice Chancellor of Strategic Communications?
I just love it, Dart. I will tell you, man, I just love being here. The people, I love everything UCLA stands for. I really say that, and I have to laugh because I will tell you, UCLA changed the personal trajectory of my life, and I've said this to my village of marketing communications folks a little bit earlier this year. I can honestly sit here and say UCLA saved my life, in a lot of ways, a lot of concrete ways. So coming back on campus, I love it. And yeah, the next question is, really, through COVID? Yes, I do. I love it through COVID. I love it through all the hard conversations and the way the world has just erupted. And I couldn't think of a better place to be around the people that I get to partner with. The people, in my group who welcome me really with open arms, and I am as outsider as maybe you can get outside of the fact that I'm a Bruin. I cut my teeth in the internet space in high tech and at public companies, so I did not know what higher ed was. I just knew that I wanted to be part of something that changes, honestly, so many lives. And since I joined, I've heard my story is not rare. And, I don't know, it's not like any other position that I've ever had. It's better. So that's been my experience.
It's interesting you say that because in your role, you also have to frame the voice of UCLA, right? You have to describe our narrative. So how would you, what would you say this thing that you love is? How would you describe UCLA? I know each of you in the audience probably have your own ways of describing it. So let's, we want to hear from you, but I also want you out there to be thinking about how you would frame, how would you share the narrative of UCLA? But Mary, since you're on stage, let's get your thoughts.
I always go back to UCLA's mission. That was the mission when I was here. That was the mission for a really long time. And the key parts of that stated mission, I think about every day. And it is essentially, to make it less formal, it is a place where all it wants to be, all it endeavors to do is to better global society. That's what UCLA is. And we do that through scholarship and research and community, really, like we do that in so many ways. But to me, I can't think of a more worthy goal and one that I have seen UCLA, commit to, make decisions on, create real action to try and do exactly that. I love the fact that the mission says our global society, because that is the world at large. And so for any alumni that are tuning in from across the pond, wherever you may be, that to me is, I just love that part of it. So, coming from tech, you always get this company or this question. I've gotten this question a lot where it's like, what are you, a tech company or a media company or a video game company? When I think of what UCLA is, it is a force to make the, global society better. And that's pretty cool to me.
That's powerful. That's just amazing to think about that narrative. So, folk, at this time, I'd like to just, welcome a very special guest that we have. I believe she is with us tonight. I want to acknowledge the original and first peoples of this land again, the Tongva, the Chumash, and Tataviam, as stewards of this land and as people that we want to lift up. And so I want to thank our special guest, Shannon Speed, for joining us. Professor Speed is a professor of gender studies and anthropology, as well as the director of the American Indian Studies Center. Dr. Speed is both the past president, is also the past president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. Welcome tonight, Dr. Speed.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. It's such a pleasure to have you here. Now, you've been hearing our conversation tonight, and we're really excited to have you on. Can you help contextualize from your perspective, sort of what is this? What do you think this means? What does this represent, both in sort of the narrative of UCLA, but also to the communities that we serve?
Well, I have to admit that I joined your conversation quite late, just a few minutes ago. But in terms of, thinking about the communities that we serve, I think UCLA, has a particular set of historic relationships to the Native community, some of which were, set up long before we got here, and some of which we're responsible for now. And, one of the things I'd love to talk with you all about is the ways that we can kind of amplify our efforts to repair relations that have been difficult historically for a variety of reasons, and also to kind of improve the experience of our students, staff, and faculty on the UCLA campus.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Speed. Now, a lot of folk don't know that LA County has one of the largest Native American Indian populations, urban populations in the country, right? During the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the federal government promised homes and jobs and opportunities for Native Americans, American Indians to relocate to LA County, but actually those things never materialized. So people don't really know, hey, that actually that there's a large Native American, American Indian population here in LA. So when you talk about wanting to build that relationship, what does that look like? Does that start with awareness? Does that start with sort of resource? What does that building of the relationship look like?
Well, you're absolutely right. We are the largest city of Native Americans in the country, and California also has the largest population of Native Americans in the country. And because of that, and for all the reasons that you're laying out, relocation policies and a variety of things, that's a very diverse population within the Native American community. So there are a lot of different things that need to be done, but I think it's very, very important that we start, as I think UCLA has, with the Gabrielino Tongva community. And the reason for that is that UCLA is located on the lands that the Gabrielino Tongva are the traditional land caretakers of.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Now, we've been talking about campus naming and how we sort of carry forward the legacy of the university, both thinking about the stories and the histories that we tell, as well as the stories and histories that we have not told. How would you, suggest that, with our campus naming partners here today and in our audience today, how would you suggest that we begin to identify the history of the land and the stories of the people of the land that are not often reflected in our buildings?
Well, we've already begun with some things. So we've started with a land acknowledgement, an institutional land acknowledgement that's approved at the highest levels at UCLA. And I think that really does help to render visible the original Native population that is usually invisibilized for people and for our students. I think other efforts that are underway, like the creation of a memorandum of understanding between the university and the tribal nation of the Gabrielino Tongva as almost a nation-to-nation relationship, is very, very important, and that's in process, but hopefully will be completed soon. There's been the establishment of a plaque recognizing the Tongva as the traditional land caretakers of the lands UCLA is seated on, that is right next to the Founders Rock on UCLA campus. Those are all terrific ways to start signaling that we recognize the Native community. I think they go a long way toward letting the community know and to letting our students know, right? And to helping our students to feel, our Native Bruins to feel that they're in a safe space on campus, that they're in a place that welcomes them.
Fantastic. I really appreciate you sharing that, and also reflecting and acknowledging the hard work that's going into creating visibility, right? I think often one of the things that those of us who are in society can be guilty of is erasure, right? Erasure of other people's history. So through this campus naming process, we're sort of asking ourselves, like, how do we interrupt that process? How do we interrupt this idea that people's in their history ought to be erased or should be erased? And so I thank you for lifting that up. So given what you just shared, now this will be our final question before I come back to you, Mary, and we close it out. Given what you just shared, Shannon, how, right, we're talking about campus naming, but how would you recommend that those of us who are listening tonight in our, offer up our support in our own personal lives? How can we begin to take action in support of our Native American and or American Indian communities here in Los Angeles County?
Well, recognizing their presence is a good start. Land acknowledgements, I think, can be very helpful as long as they don't become sort of just a checkbox that people mark off and say, okay, I did the land acknowledgement, I'm done. Engaging with the history of this place and knowing about it, right? And knowing that Indigenous peoples are still here and making important contributions, both in society and on our campus. There's still a lot of work to do. And so I'd really love to see our alumni involved in building better relations for Native students, faculty and staff, as well as with our Native nations that surround us in the community.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful, and certainly I think we have our first Native American or American Indian leader in the federal government, right? And as the Secretary of, as the Interior Secretary, Deborah Haaland, I believe it is, or Haaland, who is there to help in some ways connect to the land, to restore access to the land for tribal communities as well. I know that the UC also has a policy of acknowledging and recognizing the historical burial grounds of tribal communities, and making sure that we preserve those remains and pay respect to and honor those remains, and sort of figure out sort of how we manage the land around that as well. So I think that there's a lot of work still yet to be done in this area, but I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your wisdom with us as well.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, Mary, look, we've been talking about this. We're talking about land. We're talking about naming. We're talking about UCLA communications. We are also talking about our kids prior to this, right? And how we communicate to our kids. So, many of us have families. Many of us are trying to figure out how to navigate through this pandemic, and we're now coming out of it. What do you see ahead for UCLA's future and how we communicate around that future?
Yeah, we are thinking about the next part of what is to come. So short-term view, this will be the first time that half of our students, it'll be their first experience on campus this fall. So what we are thinking about is, how to create a way in which to bring everyone back, to UCLA in a way where we are making it celebratory, but also not all rah, because we must acknowledge the past year and a half of real feelings, social anxiety. You and I were talking about being parents, and my twin boys are 8, and they went from all remote to going back to school for about 2 weeks. And I will tell you, it's a whiplash for everyone, and just trying to wrap your feelings around all of that. So what can we do in terms of creating some emotional catharsis for that? I think, what's in store for the future. And this is, by the way, where we hope to have alumni support too. Part of what we're trying to do is try and revitalize our college town, Westwood. So more on that, but make it where we all want to come back to. We all want to see that place thrive, and we can't let the next Stan's Donuts leave. So this is something I have a lot of heart for, and my team has been doing a lot of really great thinking on. I guess I would just say, with all of that, we are really trying to honor the moment, trying to speak authentically, not trying to make it all rah, happy, because that's not authentic, and doesn't track to our transparency and humanity, but just try and think of the collective sort of emotional ball that has been the world, and try and communicate with a lot of empathy. So that's our starting place.
That's so fantastic. And yes, to UCLA and our Westwood and College Town experience. I know, as an undergrad, I can tell you back in the day, not only going to D.D. Reese, getting those quarter cookies were amazing, but being able to go to the theater and also get Mongolian barbecue when it was there. I mean,
Yeah, I had a whole technique.
it was a thing. What, for Mongolian barbecue?
No, I had a system on how to get as much as I could.
Right, that's right. That's absolutely right. Make sure you put the right sort of mix of sauce in it as well. Yeah, we got to make sure that the community is thriving, as well as supporting our university, and our students and our faculty and staff, and alumni who come back to visit as well. I want to thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Please note that we're going to be taking a brief summer break. We're going to return with our town hall series in the fall, and we really welcome your ideas and feedback on topics for next year. We want to make this as relevant and as open to you all as alums. So if you want to send us some ideas on what you think would be a really interesting topic to cover at the start of the fall, please go ahead and email Julie Sina at jsina at support.ucla.edu. Again, that's jsina at support.ucla.edu. I want to thank my special guest, Dr. Shannon Speed, and our amazing Vice Chancellor of Strategic Communications, Mary Osako, for joining us tonight. Folks, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you. We wish you all the best over the summer. We hope that you get some rest, that you get to enjoy yourself coming out of the pandemic, and that you stay safe in the midst of all of this. I want to thank you all again for this amazing town hall and for such a great series at the start of this year. With that being said, thank Team Alumni, and to all of you, go Bruins.